Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. This is Rabia Mahmood and welcome back to lecture number 7. Today we are going to discuss the topic, the primitive Old English period. Before this, in our previous lecture we have been discussing prehistory of English language. In that prehistory we were noticing that how and which were the factors that were contributing towards the development and the rise of English language. And in this lecture we are actually coming to one historical period in the history, and that historical period is known as primitive Old English period. This primitive Old English period, it ranges between 450 to 700 AD. 450 to 700 AD, although it was not too long a period, although not many things were done at that time, not many contributions were made, yet it is the beginning. It is the beginning. It is leading us towards the upcoming historical events, towards the upcoming historical periods. So it is important because it is the base. It is the initiation of the emergence of English language. Before I move on to describing all the tricky and small details of primitive Old English language, I would like to give you an overview of what this primitive Old English period is about. Firstly, you must keep in mind this primitive Old English period, that in prehistory we have also noticed that many invasions were going on. There were many conquerings and there were many attacks that were going on England. So by this time England was once again conquered by Emperor Claudius and it was made a part of Roman Empire. A major change in the history of England. It was really a big thing that was done at that time. England was made a part of Roman Empire. It was not a separate entity. It was working. It came under the regime of that empire. So it was a big geographical change, and definitely all these geographical, political, cultural and social changes are going to make an impact on the history of anything. And while here we are discussing history of English language, so it means that it is going to make an impact on the history of English language. So finally, right now, what you need to remember about primitive Old English period, the first thing is that by this time England was already conquered by one emperor, and the name of that emperor was Claudius. The second, when now we are moving from the geographical changes to the changes that were taking place in English. As in our course, History of English Language, our main concern is the language, is English language. So we'll see that what kind of changes have taken place in that era. Actually, one, as it is a primitive era, it is just the start, it is just the roots from where all the things were emerging, from where English language was emerging. So we are saying in this period we have noticed a very few and minor things were noticed. Not as there was not a great variety of written language that was present in that era. So so far as the sounds are concerned, while we talk about language, sounds are the first thing that come into our mind, and we say that sound changes were noticed at that time of history in the primitive Old English period. The first change is the changes of sound. As you know that there are two types of sounds. One is the consonant sounds, and the others are vowel sounds. So the consonant sounds were changed. How the consonant sounds were changed, you are going to look at it in the upcoming lecture. In the rest of the lecture, I have dealt with this topic in a very detail, so you are going to look at that as well. Changes in the Firstly, the consonants, like for example k consonant was changed with the ch. K was changed with the ch, and before the front vowel, for example in the words like child, it became child in the primitive Old English period. Then the changes that have taken place in the vowels basically changed, the front vowels only changed, and we are going to look at it in the upcoming lecture right now. And apart from this, no more significant changes and no more significant events were noticed. The primitive Old English period, it was about 500 BC. Britain was invaded by the Celtic tribes, who ruled the islands undisputed for about 500 years. In 43 AD, however, the islands were invaded by the Emperor Claudius, and Britain became part of the Roman Empire. See how the things are changing. It started with the 500 BC, and Britain was invaded by the Celtic tribes. Yes, Britain was invaded by the Celtic tribes, who ruled the islands undisputed for 500 years. They have been reigning over there for almost 500 years, and then in 1443 AD the islands were invaded by Emperor Claudius. Yes, then another emperor came and they were invaded by a new emperor, and it became a part of the Roman Empire. Let's see what happened after that. In the second point, Britain was totally conquered except for the Scotland, where the Celtic Scots and non-Indo-European Picts reigned sovereign. Yes, almost the new tribes were coming in. They were making it their own part, and they were actually different conquests were going on. What happened then, that Britain was totally conquered as the new tribes came in and they attacked and they invaded. It was totally conquered except for one or two places, and one important place is that of Scotland. And Scotland, what happened within Scotland, actually a sovereign state was going on, a sovereign reign was going on, where the two different tribes that we regard, the Celtic and the Scots, they Celtic Scots on one hand, and the second was non-Indo-European Picts. Yes, they were reigning that the rest of the part of the Scotland as a sovereign state. Yes, now what happened when Britain was made a part of the Roman Empire? Actually there came a collapse of the Roman Empire as well. What happened? Let's see into the details. When the Roman Empire collapsed and the Roman legionaries went home, they left a power vacuum in Britain. There was a collapse in the power of the Roman, and definitely when one thing goes away, there is always a vacant place. The place was left vacant, and they left a very important thing, a power vacuum. Yes, these are the two important words. They left a power vacuum because the rulers have been collapsed, and it has they have gone away. There was totally a decline of the civilization of everything. So they left a power vacuum in Britain. Now the Scots and the Picts advanced southwards, and the weak Celts could not keep them back. Now when the Scots and the Picts, who were confined firstly to one part of the Britain, that was the Scotland, where they were running some sovereign state, actually they started coming forward. When they saw that the Roman Empire has collapsed and it has gone down, they started coming forward. They started invading the rest of the part of the Britain, and they started moving southwards. And what as a result, the Celtics who were already living there, actually the main power has collapsed, and that's why they could not keep them. They could not stop them by coming to them. Actually, at this point, I remember a very famous lines of W.B. Yeats. He said in his poem in The Second Coming, the name of the poem is Second Coming, and he says, the center can't hold, the things fall apart. So the things they fall apart. The center, that was the center of the Roman Empire, was the center basically, and it, when it collapsed, it had a fall. They fall everywhere. The distressed Celts decided to seek help from the Germanic tribes living in present-day southern Denmark and northwestern Germany. Now what happened? The Celts who were living there in that part, they decided to seek help from the three Germanic tribes. The Germanic tribes who were living in the present day southern Denmark, the Germanic tribes who were living in Denmark as well as in western Germany, as the Celts were very much weak. They started seeking the help of those powerful nations. It was a fatal mistake. Why? Let's see that how did it prove to be a fatal mistake. Because once you are weak, you yourself need the manpower, the others are not definitely going to help, as it is a very, very well said thing that God helps those who help themselves. They perhaps started seeking the help of others in spite of believing in themselves and having courage. They left it and they started seeking the help of the Germans. Now it proved to be a fatal mistake. The three Germanic tribes called the Angles, the Saxon and the Jutes did not only conquer the Scots, but seeing that the islands were fertile, they pushed the weakened Celts to the peripheries of the islands, that is Wales, Cornwall and Ireland, and took the land for themselves. This was a great invasion, a fatal mistake, a mistake that changed the world, that changed the map of the world. And see what has happened in this mistake. The three Germanic tribes called the Angles and the Saxons, they were the three tribes, the Angles, Saxons and the Jutes. These were the three Jutes. They were already in power. They came, they invaded, they conquered the Scots, the Scottish, but seeing that islands were fertile, they pushed the weakened Celts. The Celts who were already the residents of those areas, they pushed them back to the peripheries of the islands. They pushed them towards the peripheries. Peripheries are the outskirts of some area. They pushed them into the peripheries of the islands. Wales, Cornwall and Ireland are examples of those areas where they were pushed, and they took the land for themselves. They started reigning. By 600 AD, the victory was complete and England and English was born. Yes, with the victory of these two things, the England and English was born. This was a great victory that came, and Britain and England, firstly regarded as England and English, it was born. Let's see then what happened in the next era. We know very little about the exact nature of the primitive Old English, since only a few runic inscriptions have been found dating from this period. Definitely, while we talk about the primitive Old English period, it is very, very much old. It is not even the old period. It is the period that started even before that, and definitely there are very little evidences, there are very little inscriptions that have been found, and they could tell us a little about those things. Now what happened? Actually, we do however knows that some angles, sounds that took place during the primitive Old English period, we have been able to found only a little of the sounds. We have like a bit emphasis to the sound changes and that took place during the primitive Old English period. Otherwise we could not trace a lot of things. This is because certain sound patterns had changed in the Old English by the time extensive written texts are recorded, around 700 AD. Sound patterns that remained in the original Western Germanic languages. Why we have been able to find some of the patterns, some of the sound patterns? Because certain sound patterns had changed in the Old English. The sounds that existed already in the English period, they have already been changed in this period. So Certain sound patterns has changed in Old English, and by the extensive written texts are recorded. While we see that the sounds that existed before in the primitive Old English period and the Old English period, they have changed. There is a gap, there is a change in them. So when they changed, then definitely we got to know, yes, this is the change that we are having, and these were the things that existed earlier. Yes, the first one is I umlaut. I umlaut can be seen as a kind of assimilation whereby a front vowel towards the end of a word affects a vowel of a preceding syllable, raising it. I umlaut is, we can say, it's a kind of assimilation. Again we are talking about the sounds, again we are talking about the formation of the sounds, the assimilation of the sounds, where one unit of sound, it combines, it assimilates with the other. It's a kind of assimilation whereby a front vowel towards the end of a word, there is a vowel that comes towards the end. For example, in the word, for example, it's the consonant that comes at the end. A front vowel towards the end of a word affects the vowel of a preceding syllable, raising it. In many cases, the final front vowels were later lost. Actually, it's about the front vowels that sometimes lost because of the assimilation, and sometimes they were stressed and they were pronounced, because many Germanic inflectional endings, including some noun plural endings and non-finite verb forms, contain the front vowels. The front vowels are e and a. The word this thing, this I, it is pronounced as e. For example, in eat, this is a. For example, in bed. Umlaut changes are relatively frequent and explain many rather strange forms in English. These would explain different forms in English later on. Yes, consonant changes in the primitive Old English period. Not only the assimilation was affected, but also it was not only about the vowels, but it was also about the consonants that have changed in the Old English period. For example, the consonants like k, it changed into ch. This is k, this is ch. Before front vowel, for example, child changed into child. Then came the next, and that is g. G changed into the sound j. The sound is j. It's g that changed into j. Before the front vowel, for example, gilden changed into yelden, yield. Yes, the word is yield or yelden. Yes. The word, the consonants like s and k, sk, sk, they changed into one vowel, and this vowel is pronounced as sh. As this is sh in all positions. It's not skull, it's shell, shell, skull, shell. It's sh. F, that is a voiced consonant, it changed into v. F changed into v between the voiced sounds. This explains modern English patterns such as half and halves. This is, this is also there in our modern English. So it explains this modern English pattern in a way that this f sound changed into v, half into halves. Now we are going to look into the details of some of the events that have been very, very critical, that have been very, very crucial in the history of English language. Actually, it is said by different people that there were so many events that have shaped the history of English language, but today I am going to talk about the major 5 events that have shaped the history of English language in a very different way. See, let's look at these events in detail and study them in detail. The first period the first event, rather, we are talking about events, we are talking about one event, that how one event has caused some changings in the shaping of English language. Yes, let's look at the first event, and this event is the Anglo-Saxon settlement. Anglo-Saxon settlement. It is never easy to pinpoint exactly when a specific language began. Yes, this is so true. You never know, I don't know, although we are moving on to our 7th lecture today, but perhaps again there are so many questions. There are so many questions that are unsaid, that are unanswered yet. We don't have any answers. Yes, why? Because these have not been answered yet in the whole of the ages. People have been trying, people have been researching, people have been exploring these fields, but still they don't have the answers. Let's see. Actually we don't know the exact origin, we don't know the exact language, what is the truth in them, but still we are shaping our mind, we are coming to some conclusions that okay, this thing is linked to that. For example, in the case of English, we can at least say that there is little sense in speaking of the English language as a separate entity before the Anglo-Saxons came to Britain. Yes, the important thing to note is that in the case of English, we can say that at least there is a little sense in speaking of the English language as a separate entity before the Anglo-Saxons came to Britain. While we have talked before this about the prehistoric period, we have seen that how different things diffused, how the people started migrating to other tribes, to other countries. Now, one important point to note here is that English language, it was known as a separate entity after the collapse of the Roman Empire. Even before the Anglo-Saxons came to Britain, it was existing over there. It started existing as a separate entity, as an individual language. Separate entity refers to the individuality of the language that can stand on its own. So one thing is that English was there, and it was one of the languages that was spoken and perhaps in use before these Anglo-Saxons came in. Little is known of this period with any certainty, but we do know the Germanic invaders came and settled in Britain from the northwestern coastline of the continental Europe in the 5th and 6th centuries. In the 5th and 6th centuries, while we talk about the 5th and the 6th centuries, what had happened? The Germanic invaders, they were coming in, they were settling down in the Britain, and from where they were coming in? From the northwestern coastline of the continental Europe, and they started settling. Now what happened as a result of this settling? The invaders all spoke a language that was Germanic. Yes, the invaders who were coming, who were settling in the Britain as a tribe, they were speaking this one language, that was Germanic. related to what emerged as Dutch, Frisian, German and the Scandinavian languages, and to Gothic, but will probably never know how different their speech was from that of their continental neighbors. Yes, so true. Although we are saying that one language is emerging, is associated with the rest of the languages, it is emerging from the same branch, but at the same time we don't forget that the things are so much different. Even right now, if I am reading some of the words and some of the vocabulary items of French language and the German language, then I am getting to know that there are so many differences. Although these were all from the same descendant, they have emerged from the same roots, yet we see that these are quite different. They are no more similar. However, it is fairly certain that many of the settlers would have spoken in exactly the same way as some of their North European neighbors, and that not all of the settlers would have spoken in the same way. Definitely a few tribes who were coming, they were settling down, they were speaking the same Germanic, but it was not the same with the rest of the people, yet it could be same to the rest of to a small group of the tribes. Now, an important thing is that there is no written records that is found. The reason that we know so little about the linguistic situation in this period is because we do not have much in the way of written records from any of the Germanic languages of the northwestern Europe until several centuries later. Perhaps there was no printing media available that time. This we are talking about too early in the history, and the things could not have been communicated and kept a record and reported to the next generations. So we say that we have got a very little record of all these things. When Old English writings began to appear in the 7th, 8th and the 9th centuries, there is a good deal of regional variation, but not substantially more than that found in the later periods. Yet, with the passage of time, the things changes, and we started finding so many evidences of the things. We started finding many of the records of English language, and we have seen that we have found that these were more of the evidences, more of the records were seen in the later periods of the history. This was the language that Alfred the Great referred to as English in the 9th century. Yes, another important finding about this is that in this era, in this Anglo-Saxon era, the king Alfred the Great called one language that was known as English language, and it was done in the 9th century. So the important point to remember is that it was first time English was given the name of English by Alfred the Great in the 9th century. The Celts were already resident in Britain when the Anglo-Saxons arrived, but there are few obvious traces of their language in English today. Some scholars have suggested that the Celtic tongue might have had an underlying influence on the grammatical development of English, particularly in some parts of the country, but this is highly speculative. This is highly thoughtful. These are just the guesses. These are just the wild guesses. We do not have any evidence, any permanent record of these things. Yes, actually the Celts who were already we are looking at the Britain, that how different invaders are coming, they are making invasions, and how different changes are being made. The Celts who were already resident in the Britain when the Anglo-Saxons arrived, but there are the few obvious traces of their language in the English today. The Celts who were living, they were weak, yet we see everything that had lived there or that was living there, it has been making so many effects, so many influences on that. Some scholars have suggested the Celtic tongue might have an underlying influence on the grammatical development. Yes, the influence was on that of grammatical development of English, particularly in some part of the country, but this is highly speculative, this is only thoughtful, this is just an idea that it was done, and it is just an idea, perhaps it was not actually done. The number of the loan words known for the certain to have entered Old English from this source is very small. Those that survive in the modern English include brock, the badger, and combe, a type of the valley, alongside many place names. Yes, a few of the words we have seen that they are found in English, they have been collected from some other languages, or they have made a great influence on the development of English. The examples are given. For example, the word brock and the badger, comb, that refers to some valley. These are some of the influences that have entered in the Old English. The second event that changed a lot, that had a great influence on the development of history of English language, was that of the Scandinavian settlements. The next invaders were the Norsemen. The first invader, let us just have a quick recapitulation. The first invaders were Anglo and Saxons. They came, they invaded. These were actually the main tribes. They were the three tribes of Germanic tribes, Anglo-Saxons and Jutes. They came and they had taken place they invaded Britain, and in that era one important thing that had happened was that Alfred the Great, who was the king, he started calling English by the name of English for the first time in the 9th century. Yes, the second is that of Scandinavian settlements. Let's see that what contribution have they made and what have they done in the field of English language. The next invaders were the Norsemen. From the middle of the 9th century, large numbers of Norse invaders settled in Britain, particularly in northern and the eastern areas. And in the 11th century, the whole of the England had a Danish king. Can you see that the tribes kept coming in, the tribes kept staying in, and what happened as a result, that these tribes had their own powers, had their own reigns, and they used to choose their own king. On that, their king, a Danish king, Canute, was selected, who was the king of the England, and it happened in the 11th century. An important time is that of 11th century. Now the next important event that took place under the Scandinavian settlements was that the distinct North Germanic speech of the Norsemen had great influence on English. Again, another influence is coming on English. Firstly, the influences were by the Anglo-Saxons, now of the Norsemen. Most obviously seen in the words that English has borrowed from this source. Definitely English is a combination of so many languages of the world, and every language has contributed and every language has given its words for the vocabulary bank of English. Most obviously seen in the words that English has borrowed from this source. These include some very basic words such as take, and even grammatical words such as they. Yes, look, these are the very, very basic words, and you would be glad to know that these two words have been borrowed from the influence of the Norseman on English. This is and the language that has influenced is the North Germanic speech of the Norseman. The next is the common Germanic base of the two languages meant that there were still many similarities between Old English and the language of the invaders. Yes, some words, for example, give, perhaps show a kind of hybridization with some spellings going back to Old English and others being Norse in origin. Yes, a very important point to note that there are some words in English that we find are, for example, give. They show a kind of hybridization. Hybridization is having different kinds of identities with some spellings. This it show hybridization in the sense, how does it show hybridization? It shows hybridization in the sense that some spellings would be going back to the Old English period. Spellings are the same as they used to be in the Old English era, and some others being Norse in the origin, and some others spellings resemble to the Norse influences and the Norse speeches in its origin. So it is a combination of different kinds of identities. It's a combination of different kind of characteristics. However, the resemblances between the two languages are so great that in many cases it is impossible to be sure of the exact ancestry of a particular word or the spellings. Yes, the point to note here is that although we say we agree that there are many resemblances in both the languages, in these two languages, but in many cases it is impossible to be sure of the exact ancestry of a particular word of a spelling. How can we be so sure? How can we say, yes, that this word has actually come from this origin? We are not that much sure. These are, most of the things are still the speculation, yet a lot of things have been proven through research, yet the speculations are there also. However, much of the influence of Norse, including the vast majority of the loanwords, does not appear in written English until after the next great historical and the cultural upheaval of the Norman context. After the Anglo-Saxons invasion, the other event that was very much influencing and that has made a lot of influence on this thing is that of Norman context. Yes, now came the era of 1066 and after. There were certain events that were also very much that we must remember for the upcoming things. The first event that took place in the 1066 was that of the centuries after the Norman conquest witnessed enormous changes in the English language. Firstly came the Norman, Anglo and the Saxons and the Jutes. Then the Celts were there, the Scots were there, the Anglo-Saxon and Jutes have also come. They are bringing with them the Germanic. Then came the Scandinavian languages. Again, it has made a great influence on the rest of the thing. And then what happened with the Norman conquest, and then came the third conquest, that was that of Norman conquest. It witnessed enormous changes in the English language. Lots and lots of changings, or the apparent and the bigger changes that have taken place in the English language came actually after the Norman conquest. In the course of what is called the Middle English period, the fairly rich inflectional system of Old English broke down. There were many systems that broke down, there were many traditions, there were many things that came up, so the things kept changing. Actually, it's more about the change. It was replaced by what is, broadly speaking, the same system English has today, which unlike Old English makes very little use of distinctive word endings in the grammar of the language. Yes, we said that the Norman conquest brought many changes, not only in the physical structure of the language, but also in the surface structure of the language. That was the deep and the surface structure of the language. There were many changes. So what happened? It was replaced by what is broadly speaking the same system. The Norman conquest brought something like that of that is very popular these days. It introduced a system that is quite similar to ours. The ours means of the contemporary English, that is a present English. Old English makes very little use of distinctive word endings in the grammar of the language. We were talking about the changes in the English. The vocabulary of English changed, we are saying, enormously, and with tremendous numbers of the borrowings from the French and Latin, in addition to the Scandinavian loanwords already mentioned, which were slowly starting to appear in the written language. Yes, the things started changing not only in the speech sounds, but also in the written language, in the form of the words. This was a great we can say this was a great difference from the Old English period to this period, primitive Old English period, that the things that had been changing only on the level of sounds, only in the phonology and only in the phonology of the language, but right now the things started changing and the words also started changing. Yes, Old English, like German today, showed a tendency to find native equivalents of foreign words and phrases. Yes, Old English, Old English was a combination that we are talking about. It is like German today. It showed a tendency to find native equivalents for foreign words and phrases, whereas Middle English acquired the habit that modern English retains today of readily accommodating foreign words. Yes, the two main eras and the two main things, the two main strategies that were adopted. Look at the first strategy. The first strategy was that if they would found a word, they would show that a native equivalent for the foreign words and phrases. In Old English period, there was a tendency, there was a trend, there was an attitude towards finding the equivalents of the foreign words and phrases of English. They started finding out that if they would found some new word that was a foreign language, they would try to find out the equivalent of the same word into the English language. But this was a tradition, this was a rule that was there in the Old English period, whereas when we come to the next Middle English period and we say they acquired the habit that modern English retains are today of readily accommodating foreign words. They started accommodating the words. Before this, the words accommodation, it was not an easy process. People were not willing to accommodate the words of some foreign languages in English. There was a hesitant attitude towards it in the Old English period, but with the modern English period, when the things started getting a bit civilized, a bit better, then the modern English, they started accommodating some foreign words in their own. There was another concept that was prevalent in this specific event, and the concept was that of trilingualism. Trilingualism in English, French and Latin was common in the words of business and the professions, with words crossing over from one language to another with ease. Yes, English, French and Latin, they say they were having so many similarities, and it was quite common that the words could easily shift from one language to another. You only have to flick through the etymologies of any English dictionary to get an impression of the huge number of words entering English from French and Latin during the later medieval period. This trend was set to continue into the early modern period with the explosions of the interest in the writings of the ancient world. Yes, why this trend was introduced? This trilingualism, tri is actually about three. Lingualism, languages. Trilingualism, it deals with a trend where the three languages were Latin, French and English, where there was a common exchange of the words of business and the professions, with where the words started crossing over from one language to the another with quite ease. And this why there was a reason to do this, because they set to continue into the early modern period with the explosion of the interest in the writings of the ancient world. Actually, the people now started taking interest into the writings of the ancient world. They wanted something new, so they started showing their interest and respect for the writings of the ancient people, the people who have already gone, the people who have already passed by. So for this reason, as you know, that the speakers of some proficient languages were not very much available at the time of one language, and all the languages were in the process of being evolved. All the languages were in the process of coming up, in the developing process. So there was the switching of from one language to another was quite easily acceptable. The next process was that of standardization. It is another event that has made a great influence on the history of English language. The late medieval and early modern periods saw a fairly steady process of standardization in English south of the Scottish border. Yes, we see when they started dealing with the English, and the English that was being acceptable now, the English that was trilingual, that had many influences of Latin and French as well. Now there was a process of standardization. Let's see that how did it develop. The late middle and the early modern periods. So a fairly steady process of standardization in English south of the Scottish border. English south of the Scottish border, the process started in the south of the Scottish border. The written and the spoken language of London continued to evolve and gradually began to have a higher influence in the country at large. Yes, it began. Yes, this was a thing that London, actually the evolution of language is again with the power, with the political power, with the advancement of technology. It is conditioned with that. We see that as London was growing, so do the language of London was growing. As for example, we see that the written and spoken language of London continued to evolve, and gradually it began to have a greater influence in the country at large. It started getting accepted by the people and the tribes who were there, and then it had a greater influence. For most of the Middle English period, a dialect was simply what was spoken in a particular area, which would normally be more or less represented in writing, although where and from whom the writer had learned how to write were also important. Yes, there were different dialects of different languages, there were some small regional varieties of language, but with this, in this process of standardization, in this event of standardization, actually what happened, people started focusing on the writing as well, on the writing of the things as well. as it is written here in this point, that most of the Middle English periods, our dialect was simply what was spoken in a particular area. Yes, it was spoken, which would normally be more or less represented in writing. Sometimes some dialects are represented in the language. Yes, they are. Although where and from where the writer had learned, they would want to see that where the writer had learned this language from. They started taking interest. They initiated this thing. So this was a rising interest in that. Then came London's domination. As I told you earlier, that London, as much as London was getting dominated, as much as London was getting higher, so in the same way the English was being spreaded, it was getting acknowledged, it was getting being accepted by the people, and see that how it was doing. It was only when the broadly London standard began to dominate, especially through the new technology of printing, that the other regional varieties of the language began to be seen as different in kind. Yes, a big development. The first biggest development is that of printing press. People started knowing each other. People started accessing the things. The things started getting published with the printing press. Now what happened? Did the regional varieties of the language began to be seen as a different kind when the languages were spoken first, then they were written, then they were reserved and recorded and printed and accessed and spread it to the people. People got to know that there are the differences even in the languages. Before this, these differences were not very much clear, but now they started realizing their differences. As London standard became used more widely, especially in more formal contexts, and particularly amongst the more elevated members of society, the other regional varieties came to be stigmatized as lacking social prestige and indicating a lack of education. Look how the things, look how the power structure is influencing everything, including language, how the power is dominating over the rest of the things. London standard became used more widely when there were so many people who started using it widely, especially in the formal context. Firstly, it started with the more formal contexts, and particularly amongst the more elevated members of the society. Elevated is the noble class of the society, is the wealthy class, is the elite class of the society, let's say, or the upper class of the society. They started using it firstly in the formal context, in the formal meetings, etc., in the professional settings, in the academic settings, and then and it was also used by the elevated members of the society, by the high and the noble members of the society. The other regional varieties came to be stigmatized. Definitely the elite class started getting dominated, and the rest of the class that was a lower class, and the languages that they were speaking, some regional varieties of the language, they came to be stigmatized. They were considered as not good. They were considered perhaps negatively. They were looked down upon by the people who were in the elevated class. Other regional varieties, it came to be stigmatized as lacking social prestige and indicating a lack of education. This is what is happening to our local and the native languages, that we have assigned a prestige to English language, and we say, yes, it is our formal language, it is a language of decor, it's a language of decorum, of high elevations, of high profile people. So what is happening? When one thing gets accepted as a dominant thing, the rest of the small things start getting vanished. Maybe in future there can come the days when our regional languages would vanish, just because we have stigmatized them, we have started looking down upon them, and we have started giving prestige to the rest of the languages that are not our own. We have started looking badly at our own thing, and we give preference and prestige to the languages of foreigners, not ours. Now it was a time of changes. Let's see that when the dominant structure was changing, see how the changes had taken place in language as well. In the same period, a series of changes also occurred in English pronunciation, though not uniformly in all dialects, which go under the collective name of the Great Vowel Shift. Yes, the first of all, the thing that changes in the language are the sounds, are the speech sounds of the things. So again, a great change has taken place in this era as well, in this event as well, and there was named as Great Vowel Shift. These were purely linguistic sound changes which occur in every language in every period of history, and they said that Great Vowel Shift is about the sound changes, about the purely linguistic sound changes, and it can occur in every language in any period of the history. The changes in pronunciation were not the result of the specific social or historical factors, but social and historical factors would have helped to spread the results of the changes. Yes, it was it was not a change because of the history, because of the society, because of the influences. Rather, the change that has taken place, it could have influenced the results in some other way around. Let's see what were the results of the changes. As a result, the so-called pure vowel sounds, which still characterize many continental languages, were lost to English. The phonetic pairing of the most long and short vowel sounds were also lost. Many things started getting lost. Perhaps they were not more acceptable, they were not accepted by the people, and perhaps some other things were more accepted and recognized and acknowledged by the people. So people started getting those things, and the first that is not accepted, that is stigmatized, they start getting vanishing, which give rise to many of the oddities of English pronunciation, and which now obscure the relationships between many English words and their foreign counterparts. Yes, these were some of the results of the changes that have taken place. And now we are going to look at the last period. The last period is that of the last. It's not the period, rather it's the event, because today we are talking about the 5 mega events that have influenced English language, the history of English language, and the last of these events is the event of colonization and globalization. Firstly, just look at the words, leave the things and leave the details that are coming in on. Colonization and globalization. Colonization is about those nations, about those communities that were colonized. Yes, is it so? Colonized. Colonized, actually, it refers to the time when British was an empire, it was in power, it was one community, and it used to have a control over a long region of this earth. They have conquered so many of the places of the world, so they used to call it a colony. That was known as British colony. Even Pakistan, as you know, it has been under the reign of Britishers, and it was also one of the British colonies. So the word refers to, the term refers to colonization. It refers to those British colonies that they made and they ruled all over the time. And the next is globalization. Globalization, the word is taken from global, something that is of global importance, something that is of universal importance in the world. Let's see that how these two events have contributed towards the history of English language. Yes, the first point is that during the medieval and early modern periods, the influence of English spread throughout the British Isles. During the medieval and early modern periods, it is now we have moved away from the history and we have come towards medieval and early modern periods. The influence of English spread throughout the British Isles, and from the early 17th century onwards, its influence began to be felt throughout the world. From one place, they started spreading on the world. They started making the world as their colony. That all that process was known as colonization. The complex process of exploration, colonization, overseas trade that characterized Britain's external relations for several centuries led to significant change in English. Yes, this is again very, very important. The complex process of exploration, where the things were being explored, where the things were being researched, and the process of colonization, where the world was turning into becoming a British colony, where the whole of the world was turning into becoming a British colony, and overseas trade, as they were expanding, they were trading not only within their own country, rather it was an overseas trade that was going on, that was spread all over the world, that characterized Britain's external relations. Definitely your overseas trade is a good replication of your relations with the people to whom you are carrying it out. For several changes, it led to significant changes in English. Let's see what were those changes that were caused by this colonization and globalization. Words were absorbed from all over the world. Yes, a very first important point is that from all over the world, the tribes kept trading to overseas. Trading is a kind of interaction. They started meeting the people, they started interacting with the people. So they had what they had interacted, and they got and they learned, they started getting influenced, the language started getting influenced, and they had many words, often by the languages of other trading and imperial nations as Spain, Portugal and Netherlands. At the same time, new varieties of English emerged, each with their own nuances of vocabulary and grammar and their own distinct pronunciations. It was now when the things were being spreaded and when the things were being migrated, actually what happened, there were some also new varieties of English that came across, that emerged, and each variety, as we see that there are so many varieties of English that we cannot understand. There is Canadian English, there is within Canada there must be thousands of dialects of English. Within Britain there are hundreds of the dialects of English. For example, there is a Welsh dialect, there is a Scottish dialect. These are the different dialects of English. Within Australia, that is the native, the countries that have their English as the native language, they have their thousands and thousands of dialects and the sub branches of English. As a very good example of the variety of English would be that Pakistani English is nowadays considered to be a one variety of English. This is also one variety that we are speaking, that we are using these days. Yes, in the same way the new variety started emerging, and each variety has its own nuances, problems of vocabulary and the grammars and their distinct pronunciation, and they had their own pronunciation. Definitely every dialect is spoken with a little bit of difference, with a little bit of differences in not only in the accents but in the syllables, in the intonation, the different things. There are different things that matter. They have, every language has its own speech sounds. So, some speech sounds are found in, let's say, let me give you an example of our own languages. Saraiki would have some speech sounds that perhaps Punjabi don't have. So in the same way, if new varieties were emerging, there were as much as problems as well, and each variety had its own vocabulary, its own lexical items, the lexical bank, as well as the grammatical structure of their, and as well as their distinct pronunciation. Now from that we came towards today's English, and most recently still, English has become a lingua franca today. It's a global language, regularly used and understood by many nations for whom English is not their first language. Yes, the first process was that of colonization. The colonization helped the Britain not only in colonizing the things, not only in colonizing the empire, not only in getting the finances and the money that they were getting, the trade that they were doing, but also the language. The language, English language, it became an international language. It was realized all over the world. More recently still, English has become a lingua franca, a global language. Lingua franca is a language of trade that is acceptable among different tribes, regularly used and understood by many nations for whom English is not their first language. Definitely it is understood, and it is spoken by the people even whose language is not English. A very good example is our nation. English is our not first language. Still we do understand, we do speak, we do write, we do listen. This is what we are doing, what English is. This is what is the importance of English is. The eventual effects on the English language of both these developments can only be guessed at today, but there can be little doubt that they will be as important as anything that has happened to English in the past 1600 years. English has lived up to the past 1600 years. It started from the Old English, it has come to the lingua franca, it has become the language of the world, and it has become the language of the world, and it is accepted, it is used as a trade unit all over the world. So with this we come towards the end of today's lecture as well. But before I end, let me give you a quick recapitulation of what we have done today. Today we started our 7th lecture with the prehistory of English language, the prehistory of English. It was not the prehistory of English language, that was in the 6th lecture that we have done, and then the 7th lecture we started our lecture with the primitive old English language, and that primitive old English language, it was really necessary to discuss a bit of the primitive old English language with you today, because this primitive old English language and the prehistory, both these things has led towards the development of Old English period that we will be discussing in our upcoming lecture, Old English period. Okay, today's lecture is started with the primitive Old English period. We have looked at different changes that have taken place. We have also seen that no much evidences and no much written records have been found of this language. So the changes have been noticed, but still no much records have been found. Then before jumping on to the exact history of English language, we have actually looked at different traces. We have looked at different events that have influenced the history of English language. These were the 5 main events of English language. We started with the Anglo-Saxons period, and then we came towards the Northern periods, or we can say we came towards the Scandinavian period of history, or the Scandinavian events, Scandinavians' invasion on English language that really caused great changes. Then we started with the 1066, and after that, what happened after that with the medieval ages, with the Norman conquest and all that. Then came English has been introduced, English has been established by that time, and then came the event of standardization. Standardization, it started by a language is recognized and accepted and acknowledged once it is standardized, when it has become a standardized language. When English was standardized, the rest of the languages started become stigmatized. Well, looking at that detailed and complicated process of standardization, we moved on to looking the 2 more events. The 2 more events, one was globalization and the other was globalization and colonization. Within colonization, we have seen that how British Empire expanded, how London became dominant. Definitely the dialect of London became dominant, it became standardized, it became accepted, and the rest of the things were once again stigmatized at that time. And we also concluded that this is once again linked to the power element, with the power that these things have. Okay. We looked at the colonization and then the globalization. Globalization in the sense of the contemporary English, that English today is used as lingua franca. It's a language of international language, it's a language of exchange, it's a language of trade, where people use it although even it's not their first language or the second language, even then people use it. A very good example is that of the state of English when it is there in our country, in our own Pakistan. We ended up our lecture on today's English, and I hope that you have enjoyed this lecture. So wait till the next lecture, and the next lecture would be about Old English period, and I hope that you could make sense of it, that what we have talked about today. So better luck till the next lecture, and take very good care, and Allah Hafiz.